and significantly increased risk of an armed attack against us. It would require a truly gargantuan shift in our deterrence and defense.
On this Thursday, December 11th, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte chose a direct tone by saying that we are the next target of Russia, and then went further, putting a deadline on the table, saying that Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within at most 5 years. 5 years is not tomorrow, but it is a short term enough to constrain governments, budgets, industries, and military doctrines. And at the same time, and fortunately for Europe, it is long enough to allow a real transformation to happen if there is a decision and political will for it. When the NATO's military leader talks about next target, he is not necessarily describing a classic invasion with columns of armored vehicles crossing borders. The world has changed, with Rutte pointing to a scenario where Russia can try to test the alliance without it automatically activating Article 5, the main article of the alliance that says that an attack against a member is an attack against all members, and that, therefore, everyone must respond militarily. The target may be a territory, a critical infrastructure, a strong and serious hacker attack, a fabricated crisis, or a sequence of small incidents that, added up, pressure the political unit of NATO, leading its members to wonder if Article 5 should or should not be activated, thus risking a large-scale war with Russia. The test of Russia can be exactly this: to divide allies, expose hesitations, force concessions, and create precedents. A type of scenario in which the size of the attack can be small, but the strategic added impact is gigantic. Also spoke of avoiding a war on the scale that our grandparents and great-grandparents faced, a clear reference to the Second World War that devastated Europe. But what really marked Rutte's declaration was the deadline. In military terms, 5 years is enough time to expand industrial capacities, reform or create new units, train officers, and multiply the number of reservists ready to take up arms, and above all, to fill stocks that are now below the ideal. And in political terms, 5 years is a silent ultimatum. Either you act now, or you will lose the window of opportunity. Rutte also made use of a word that bothers any government: complacency. The message is simple. It is not enough to promise, it is necessary to deliver. And deliver here means two things at the same time: an increase in spending, aiming to maintain and expand investments in defense, and to expand industrial capacity, transforming these expenses into production. He also mentioned an ambitious goal discussed among the allies, which involves advancing to a higher level of investment over the next decade, with goals that appear in a public debate as far above the old 2% of GDP, with some nations already advancing in this direction, with a highlight for Poland and some Baltic countries that are approaching 5% of GDP for defense. The Russian invasion on a large scale of Ukraine rekindled the logic that many people thought had been archived in Europe. The logic of war between states with artillery, drones, air defense, heavy logistics, and massive losses. Since then, NATO has been strengthening the eastern flank, expanding exercises, repositioning capacities in dealing with air defense. But according to Rutte, this preparation, despite being seen and treated as a central priority, is being dangerously slow, which, according to him, could lead the European members of the alliance to lose the opportunity window that he made a point of referring to in his statement. Moscow insists on a narrative: NATO's expansion as a cause and justification for war. But from NATO's point of view, this narrative is seen as part of a political game, with Putin trying to present Russia as reactive, cornered, defensive, and the West as a provocateur. The problem is that, regardless of the political debate, the practical result was that the war increased the sense of risk in Eastern Europe and transformed incidents that were previously tolerated into potential triggers. And that's exactly when the tension becomes routine, that history becomes really dangerous, especially when it comes to Russia. Another heavy aspect of this discussion is the number of casualties, with estimates cited by Western leaders talking about more than 1 million casualties between Russians and Ukrainians. But why does this matter so much beyond human horror? Because it indicates two things: the intensity and industrial scale of the conflict and Putin's willingness to sustain a long war despite the tremendous human, material, and economic costs. This totally changes the calculations, because if one government believes that the other side tolerates gigantic losses, it adjusts to its own urgency. And this is one of the engines of the current discourse. The perception that Russia is learning and adapting to a real combat environment day after day. Russian society today, after almost 4 years of war, and after hundreds of thousands of young people have been killed and wounded, is anesthetized by the horrors of war. But European society, after 85 years of peace, is not. And Putin returned to give public signs that Russia would be ready to fight if Europe starts a war, reinforcing the idea that Moscow is placed as a reactive and non-aggressive part. And almost in parallel, Sergei Lavrov said that Russia has no plans to attack the European Union or NATO, even saying that it would be willing to put guarantees in writing, as if Russia was not widely known for tearing up treaties and guarantees, as it did with Ukraine itself. Another central point is that Russia is already doing exactly what Mark Rutte warned, with the Kremlin testing the reaction and unity of the alliance, as was the recent episode involving more than 20 drones invading Poland's airspace, with some of them falling over houses and causing damage. And it is precisely in these tests that the risk is, with the trigger for a conflict not needing to be a premeditated strategic decision of attack. It could be an accident, a detour, a navigation failure, a wrong identification, or a sudden shot in the face of a poorly assessed threat. This is the kind of scenario where a war doesn't start because someone wanted to conquer Europe, but because a sequence of events aiming to test the determination of the other side leads to a response that precipitates decisions that end up running out of control. When someone, like Secretary General of NATO, says 5 years, it is not a prophecy. It is an attempt to create a political deadline to solve a military problem. A way of saying that the danger is near, but that there is still time to prepare. In the end, this alert is not only about Russia, it is about Europe, and about the capacity of a democracy to organize itself in time, without panic, without hysteria, but with seriousness. All this because when the theme is security, the most expensive luxury is to think that nothing will happen.